Okay, so welcome everyone to another session of the Virtual Kant Congress. It is our great pleasure to receive today the Indian Kant group. So we are really glad that we were able to add this session to the program. And I would like to thank Vivek for putting this session together, for contacting us and inviting all the speakers. So we are happy that it worked out. And I would like to ask you to switch on your videos if possible, so that we can emulate the ambience of an in-person meeting. And I would also like to tell you that after the session, we usually keep the Zoom meeting open for informal conversations, and you are all very welcome to stay. And without further ado, I would like to hand the session over to Professor Ragura Maraju, who will moderate the session today. Thank you so much for agreeing to do that, and we're looking forward to it. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you, Luis, and Vivek for asking me to chair this session. One of the important things that I find while doing philosophy in India is the context of Kant. The British colonialism brought modernity to India, and philosophers in India looked at modern Western philosophy along with moving away from classical Indian philosophy. And it is in this context that you find their reading Descartes, whom I think they found it too rationalistic. And then they also read Hume, who devastated, scandalized the project of rationality. It is in this context that Kant came as an important savior to look at who not only continued the project of rationality, but also incorporated the critique of Hume on reason. So it is in this context, he becomes a big screen, so to say, for Indians to engage with modern Western philosophy, which they found is very liberating to their philosophical task that is informed by recent developments. And it is not as archaic as both classical Western philosophy and also classical Indian philosophy. So that is a context that I want to set for the discussion. The second context, the second point is that you find when you read the contemporary philosophers in India, three kinds of engagements with Kant. One is they try to understand Kant. And as you know, scholars of Kant, it is not that easy, but the engagement was serious and enduring. They also tried to use Kant to make different senses about philosophy to their students. You find A.C. Mukherjee, R.K. Gupta, and several others, stalwarts, who both in Calcutta and Bombay departments of philosophy, and also Madras University, where this engagement was widespread. But in addition to these two engagements, that is understanding Kant and also using Kant, you do find another dimension, namely critical engagement with Kant. That critical engagement with Kant is found in Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya, who wrote this paper called The Concept of Philosophy, which critiques Kant, and this famous essay is included in Radhakrishna Muirhead's volume Contemporary Indian Philosophy. Has become one of the standard critics of Kant. So you find that Indian philosophers had threefold, in my understanding, engagement with Kant. So the last point that I wanted to make to set the stage is the recent interest in Kant on cosmopolitanism. The cosmopolitanism has brought Kant again back into the discussion, especially in the context of asylum seekers, refugees, migration, that there's a very important even election issues in Britain, in Europe, and things like that. It is in this context I find that there is a possibility where Kant's cosmopolitanism can be used in India in a more complex way. Namely, that India is not only engaged with the people from outside entering in India or Indians going outside India, but also people moving from one state of India to other state of India. India has several states, and one state of India to other state of India also becomes a problem. So I find that this brings a new dimension to add to their existing scholarship on Kant, on cosmopolitanism. So that's why I find the third point is a fertile ground for further research, which will not only relate Kant in a meaningful way to India, but also enrich Kant, a Kantian scholarship at the global level. With these few preliminary remarks for whatever they're worth, I now request the first speaker, Dr. Vivek Radhakrishnan, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at Kriya University. Vivek's research interests include Kant's moral philosophy and reception of Kant in India. His PhD thesis was on Kant's theory of moral motivation, and he has published his articles in Contexto Kantianoso and Kantian Journal. He will now present his paper titled Kant and India, Seen Through a Glass Darkly. Over to Vivek.
Thank you, Professor Raghuram Raju. Let me just share my screen so that we get to the PPT. Okay, is my screen visible? Yeah, all right. Okay, greetings everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to first thank the organizers of VKC for making this session possible. Thanks specifically to Luis Felipe Garcia. Thanks to the chair, Professor Raghuram Raju, to the speakers, Professor Kanchana, Dr. Appar, Dr. Nishad, for coming together for this session. My paper is titled Kant in India, Seeing Through a Glass Darkly. So it's a work in progress, and I'm going to spend the time available here to discuss an outline of it. The relationship between Kant and India is but a tiny illustration of a tainted glass curtain that separated Europe and Asia in the modern era. My aim here is to showcase the nature of it in both ways, to collate Kant's scattered views on India from his writings, and to map the reception of Kant's philosophy in India. The significance of the former can be seen in the recent scholarly interest in Kant's views on race, non-European cultures, and colonialism. Mapping the reception of Kant in India is significant for tracing the specifics of Indian engagement with European philosophers during the colonial and the post-colonial periods. There are many scholars who have written on Kant reception from the standpoint of individual Indian philosophers. This includes the work of Raghuram Raju and Kanchana Mahadevan, who are both here with us. But a broader sketch of Indian reception of Kant is hardly available in the literature. Only paper of this kind is Arindam Chakravarti's Kant in India, which was presented at 8th International Kant Congress in 1995. My attempt here will be an addition to this. I will broadly map the influence of Kant's thought on the philosophical thinking in colonial India. The first part is called as Kant's India, where I'll discuss the overview of Kant's version of India. The influence of Indian philosophy on the post-Kantian German thinkers is well known. In the light of the pantheism controversy in the later half of 18th century, many German writers actively engaged with Indian philosophical thought. We see this in the literary works of Caroline von Gunderroth. We see this obviously in the philosophical tracts of Schelling, Herder, Humboldt, and Hegel. And most importantly, in the writings of Friedrich Schlegel. Unlike these figures, Kant's thought cannot be taken to be influenced by Indian philosophies in any significant way. But this is only a reference to his major critical writings, which have a universalist, cosmopolitan, and egalitarian character to them. The chief Enlightenment thinker's remarks on India belong to his anthropological and political writings, which have imperialist, Eurocentric, and racial undertones to them. Kant's problematic views on India cannot be singled out as they belong to a larger tradition of philosophical prejudice spearheaded by modern thinkers like Hume, Hegel, and Mill. Kant's comments on India are unsystematic, inconsistent, and scattered throughout his works. They can be seen in his works from as early as Observations published in 1764 to his late Anthropology, which was published in 1798. Other notable references to India can be seen in Perpetual Peace, Religion, and Lectures on Physical Geography. Now, what were his sources? Kant's exact sources on his comments on Indian society, culture, and religion are not fully evident. In his lecture notes on physical geography, Kant cites three main sources for his information on India. For his only systematic chunk of information on India that runs for around 8 pages in his physical geography, Kant credits Thomas Salmon's specific volume, The Present State of India and Ceylon, published in 1736. It belongs to the English historian's multiple volume work titled His Modern History or the Present State of All Nations. Kant also cites the works of Austrian missionary Paulinius of St. Bartholomew for information on the scientific, religious, and cultural situation of India. Finally, he also mentions Asiatic Researches, the first European journal to study Asian cultures and philosophies, published from 1788. For his other references to India, one can only speculate that Kant read Johann Brücker's 5-volume Critical History of Philosophy, published from 1742 to 1744. Further works of Bartholomew Ziegenbalg, the first pietist missionary to arrive at South India in 1706, may have been available to Kant. Needless to say, the biased travel accounts in and around the bustling city of Königsberg may have also been accessed by him. Now, what did he write about Indians? Kant's comments on Indians are loaded with assumptions from the race theory that he held dear until 1790s. He considered people from India as belonging to the oldest Hindustani race, having olive yellow skin color, cold hands, and long thighs. He considered them to be prone to swollen livers and constipated gallbladders. He took them to be generally vengeful and lacking courage. He thought that Indians were great at arts, but not at sciences. This is because of their inclination towards feeling and their inability to develop abstract concepts. But he also took them to have a great deal of natural aptitude and discipline. Some other comments, especially from his lectures on physical geography, are filled with Oriental tropes with an exotic air to them. For instance, he mentions that Indians have huge banyan trees and immense-sized elephants, that they cure diseases by magic, make unique snake stones, and believe that moon is above sun, that there are wandering fakirs and mendicants who do not sleep lying down, but bring a great deal of blessing to the land. Now, at some places, he expresses a fair level of awareness about the social norms and customs of 18th century India. For instance, he makes a mention about the age-old controversial practice of sati prevalent among Indians. He also makes reference to Indian caste system as an instance of our propensity to servility. At 2 places, he lists the 4 major castes and their respective temperaments. What is most interesting is that 2 of his comments on India illustrate the shift on his position on colonialism. As is well known within the scholarly circles, Kant defended colonialism till the late 1790s. This has its expression in a quote on India from his Doyne Lectures on Physical Geography in 1782. As you can see from the quote on the screen, he says that India would be a happier nation under the European sovereign rule. Cut to his Perpetual Peace in 1795, we see him condemning the Britishers for inciting wars and rebellion in India under the pretext of setting up trade. Kant also had a passing familiarity with the religious beliefs and practices prevalent in India. He makes cursory references to the Trimurti of Hindu deities, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, the principle of karma without calling it so, idol worship of the Hindu gods, belief in the holiness of cattle, and also the monism underlying the polytheism of Vedas. Now, I would like to move to the second part of my paper, that is discuss the reception of Kant in India broadly. At the outset, one can unmistakably claim that Kant's philosophy has had a very generous reception in India. This is evident from the scholarly discussions and volumes meant to commemorate Kant in the recent past. Just to point out a few instances, two separate seminars were held at Calcutta and Madras in 1974 for his 250th birth anniversary. Proceedings volume of these seminars was published a year later by Max Muller Bhavan in Madras. Indian Philosophical Quarterly, a long-standing journal of philosophy in India, brought out a special issue on Kant to mark his 200th death anniversary in 2004. A few years later, in 2007, two edited volumes titled Essays on Kant on the Philosophy of Immanuel Kant were released to commemorate 200 years of Kant. For his 300th birth anniversary this year, apart from today's session, thanks to VKC, we also have an upcoming symposium on Kant organized by Goethe Institute and Mumbai University. Now, these are active instances of attempts at receiving Kant's philosophy with open arms by Indian philosophers. But interest in Kant's thought has been among Indian philosophers since early 1800s. This spark of enthusiasm grew into a full-blown fire of engagement when we moved to the 20th century. The spirit of Indian Kant reception cannot be understood without understanding the broader philosophical context of pre-independent colonial India. Colonial Indian philosophy is generally characterized as an interesting medley of philosophies from India's own classical past and fine-tuned accounts of modern European philosophy that was received from outside. The roads for the European philosophical theories into India were not, however, smooth. One important challenge was that there was a significant time gap between the production of a philosophical theory or a text and its availability here. For instance, most Indian thinkers waited and relied on Max Muller's English translation of the first critique that was published 100 years after Kant wrote it. Moreover, they reached these books and theories reached here in either dismantled state in bits and pieces or with a different essence than what it had in its original context. For instance, Indian philosophers in the 19th and 20th century received both Kant and Hegel with a strong flavor of British idealism. British idealist version of Kant and Hegel came through British teachers in India such as A.C. Hogg and David Drummond, who were in turn influenced by idealists like T.H. Green, Bradley, and J. Sterling. It is no wonder that the revival of Vedanta school of thought in the 20th century is Indian idealism at its best, with thinkers like K.C. Bhattacharya behind it. Further, these European theories and texts had a problem of fit in Indian context. This evoked two responses in the form of adjustments. First, adjusting philosophies from Indian classical past to showcase affinities and divergences with European philosophers. And second, calibrating European philosophical theories to deal with or understand philosophical issues that are original to India. The former was necessitated as a reaction to the allegations of absence of philosophizing in India. With respect to Kant reception, this can be seen in the works of Vivekananda and Radhakrishnan. Calibrating European philosophies to India was an active attempt at reclaiming the past using modern terminologies and idioms. Kant appropriation of K.C. Bhattacharya is a classic example of this. Now, keeping this general context in mind, I want to historically trace the introduction and influence of Kant's philosophy in 19th and 20th century India. I divide the historical reception of Kant's thought in India into four chronological phases: Advent phase, affinity phase, assimilation phase, and scholarship phase. In each of these phases, I will briefly refer to a few Indian philosophers whose works were influenced by Kant's thought. The advent of Kant's thought into India began in early 19th century with Scottish missionaries and free thinkers who promoted English liberal education among Indians. In the works of public philosophers like Keshav Chandra Sen and Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, we see first mentions of Kant through the lens of 18th century Scottish philosophy. These thinkers mostly grouped Kant with Scottish common sense philosophers like Thomas Reid and William Hamilton. They believed that Kant took the highest rational faculty to be akin to a special intuitive faculty of common sense. Special mention must be made here to Henry Derozio, the first Indian poet in English, who disseminated the critical spirit of enlightenment to the youth of Bengal at that time. Trained under a Scottish intellectual, David Drummond, Derozio wrote an article called Objections to the Philosophy of Kant in 1820s. This piece is unfortunately lost to us. The second phase begins with Indian philosophers' exposure to the broad affinities between the British idealist version of Kantianism and Vedanta philosophy. Swami Vivekananda, for instance, repeatedly mentions in some of his works that Kant's phenomenal-noumenal distinction was foreshadowed in Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. One can perhaps see a parallel between the idealist treatment of Kant in India with the pantheist treatment of Indian thought in the post-Kantian Germany. Around the same time, we also see Radhakrishnan's attempt to go beyond the framework of affinities to show the divergences between Kant and Bhagavad Gita. Radhakrishnan's paper comparing the ethical frameworks of Kant and Gita is the first in the series of such comparisons around that time. Such comparative readings of Kant were meant to juxtapose modern European thought and Indian philosophy. With more Kant engagement, the first generation of academic philosophers calibrated Kant's philosophy to assimilate it with Indian philosophy. The leading figure in this phase of assimilation was K.C. Bhattacharya, or KCB. KCB creatively calibrated Kant's philosophy to synthesize it with Advaita philosophy. One could make a comparison between KCB's Advaitic appropriation of Kant with Aquinas and Augustine's Christianizing of Aristotle and Plato in the medieval times. Except that in the case of former, the politics of assimilation was clear and made very evident. In his celebrated discourse, Swaraj in Ideas, KCB critically discusses the politics underlying the reception of modern European ideas by Indian minds. He suggests that modern philosophical ideas must be assimilated into Indian thought without losing its own traditional ideals. His study of Kant's works mainly appears in two published works of his, Studies in Kant and Implications of the Philosophy of Kant. Bhattacharya's Advaitic commitment to theories of self, freedom, and the absolute serves as the starting point for his constructive engagement with Kant's writings. He argues that Kant's negative approach to the unknowability of self in his first critique is the problem that needs an Advaitic resolution. His constructive interpretation of Kant's philosophy carved a unique path towards engagement with Kant's works. Following this, Kant's scholarship involving closer reading of texts began with Humayun Kabir, who translated Kant's first introduction to the third critique into English for the first time. His 4 introductory essays on the unity of Kant's critiques set the stage for the commentarial tradition within Indian Kant scholarship. Rash Vihari Das, one of KCB's students, soon published his commentary on the first critique in 1948. Ironically, despite Kant's rejection of a substantial self, we see a number of Indian philosophers writing on Kant's account of subject or self-knowledge. While A.C. Mukherjee briefly touches on this topic, Pranab Kumar Sen and Nikunja Vihari Banerjee wrote full-length works on Kantian self in 1956 and 1974, respectively. During 1970s, R.K. Gupta, a Delhi-based scholar, once again turned to Kant's ethics and published his works in international journals, including Kant Studien. Now, I want to end this paper with a note that I started with, the existence of a tainted glass curtain between Asia and Europe broadly. The thought barrier may not be balanced in the case of Kant-India connection. Kant's remarks on India certainly reflect a strong sense of distortion and othering filled with inconsistencies. Indifferent to such remarks, Indian reception of Kant was generous. But due to spatial and temporal challenges in Kant's reception, Indian thinkers bent Kant's philosophy to use them appropriately to suit their philosophical context. Today, with easy access to English translation of Kant's works and Anglo-American Kant scholarship, there is a rapid growth of Kant scholarship in India. With this increasing interest on Kant, there is a need to systematically compile and critically collate the Indian reception of Kant's philosophy. I hope this presentation of mine is a step in this direction. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Vivek, for listing the lot of works on Kant. We will have the discussion at the end of all 4 papers. I now request Professor Kanchana Mahadevan, who teaches philosophy at the University of Kanchana Mahadevan teaches philosophy at the University of Mumbai. She has been engaged with Kant in her pedagogy, curriculum development, and research throughout her active career. She teaches Kant's Critique of Pure Reason along with his works in practical philosophy. Her research interests include Kant's second critique, the Critique of Judgment, and his works on religion. She has actively contributed to the critical literature on Kant, especially the environmental, post-colonial, race, and feminist critics. She also reads Kant through the lens of Kant's reception in the Western and Indian context. She will now be presenting her paper titled Rereading Kant on the human and nature relationship beyond Chakravarti's crisis of an enduring Kantian family. Over to Kanti.
Thank you, Professor Raghuram-Raju, for your kind introduction. And before I present, I would like to thank Dr. Vivek Radhakrishnan and Dr. Luis Garcia for their invitation and this opportunity to share my thoughts on Kant. My paper 2 is a work in progress, and unfortunately, I don't have a PPT, but I'll see what best I can do. I am also trying to understand Kant in the context of a certain reception, a certain Indian reception of Kant. Perhaps one could call it an Indian reception, I'm not sure, since it is a diasporic Indian thinker. So Dipesh Chakravarti has critiqued Kant as putting forth a philosophy that is basically responsible for the environmental crisis and the Anthropocene epoch that we see today. He suggests that the way out is to separate oneself, or to abandon rather Kant, and look for other models. Now, I am trying to suggest that there are readings in Kant, passages in Kant's works, which do suggest that there is an anthropocentric dimension, a very strong anthropocentric dimension, but there are also passages, especially in the Critique of Judgment, that point otherwise. And perhaps we could think about Kant's aesthetics as coming to our rescue, to Kant's rescue here. In this context, I develop, or rather try to extend, Paul Guyer's very early essay that he wrote in 1991, arguing that for Kant, certain aesthetics of nature implies an awareness of one's moral duties to oneself. So on this note, I am trying to suggest that there is possibility of reading Kant's aesthetics by looking at nature itself as a work of art. So I go beyond Guyer to go beyond the individual self-awareness and to point out that Kant's ontology of nature itself has a certain affinity with an artwork, and perhaps this reading will help us get beyond the utilitarian readings of Kant that have become very strong in the environmental critiques of Kant. So I'll just start out by reading. There are 3 parts to this paper. The first is the critique of Kant's alleged anthropocentrism, and the second would be takes a look at Paul Guyer's argument that there is a relationship between aesthetic judgment and moral judgment in Kant. And the third part, I developed the ontology of nature. I present Kant's ontology of nature as drawing upon a work of art and a work of art as drawing upon nature as a way of getting out of the utilitarian perspective towards nature. So what is a human being is Kant's most fundamental question, which he has approached from various points of view, such as natural sciences, history, anthropology, education, as Robert Loudon in his, I'm sorry, as Robert Loudon points out in his introduction. This question is not a value-free question of the sciences, nor is it an arbitrary question. It is posed through perspectives that are connected through the concern for morality. It seeks descriptions of the self and the world in which the question is posed so that there is a moral improvement in both. Thus, for science to quote thus for Kant to quote, the sciences are principia for the improvement of morality. Following Loudon, Kant's writings on anthropology, history, and education have an empirical rootedness, and they may also be viewed as central contributions to what Kant calls the second part of morals. Now, they are attempts to comprehend the human being empirically so that the extent to which moral principles can be materialized can be understood. However, in narrating the mobility from natural condition to that of morality, Kant, in his work on history, namely the speculative beginning of human history, points out, I quote Kant here, nothing other than the transition from the crudity of a merely animal nature into humanity, from the go-kart of instinct to the guidance of reason. In a word, from the guardianship of nature into the condition of freedom would allow for the human being becoming truly moral. And this indeed is the problem that Dipesh Chakravarti has with Kant. He points out that this particular passage and Kant's essay on the speculative beginning of human history adopts a one-dimensional human-centric perspective which looks at nature as a standalone problem. So something like climate justice becomes a standalone problem, and it can be approached through diverse political perspectives, such as, excuse me, such as distribution, managing renewable resources, and so forth. Now, this approach instrumentalizes nature, and it would, for example, allow for a wiser use of resources in the spirit of Kant. I quote Chakravarti here, wiser use of resources, but it could also lead to policy framing, but then it foregrounds the human being as having a sovereign agency. Chakravarti notes that this is a geology of morals. I quote him here. Kant defends an opposition in this geology between the natural physical aspect and its moral aspect. The natural aspect remains intact, static as it is, and the change and development takes place in the moral domain. For Kant, the human exit from paradise was nothing other than the transition from raw state of nature, as that quote points out, the raw state of animal nature, to that of genuine moral humanity. And for this, the community with animals, as Kant puts it in his speculative history, would have to be overcome in order to engage with the community of human beings. And all human beings are equal recipients of nature's gifts, to quote Kant. Hence, the notion of equality itself becomes one of distribution, which is reflected in this perspective of distributing the resources of the earth in order to, and distributing them in a wise manner in order to resolve the crisis of nature for Chakravarti. This approach, which is based on the Kantian fable, as he puts it, of separating the human being from nature, which is also coming from the Christian, which also has Christian origins in the Genesis. Chakravarti finds this fable to be symptomatic of the human ecological footprint, and it has a certain way of thinking about human agency as dominant, yet it fails to understand that one cannot resolve the problem of the human ecological footprint through human methods, human-centric methods or anthropocentric methods, and the use of strategic rationality, but rather one needs to diagnose the problem itself very clearly as the problem of the human being having permeated every part of the world. And this is because of the kind of approach that thinkers like Kant have propagated, namely the approach of separating nature from culture, nature from morality, the human being from nature, and so forth. David Baumeister has critiqued Chakravarti, and he has also agreed with him that there is this fable which drives this inextricable wedge between the moral and the sensory dimensions of human beings, as well as human beings and nature. And this is indeed the impasse that we notice all around us. However, the whole problem is, according to Baumeister, Chakravarti's reading of Kant, which largely confines itself to the conjunctural or the speculative beginning of human history. Now, he cites passages from Critique of Judgment, but his argument is largely based on the reading of this work. And Kant also, I would like to add to this that it is not just in this speculative beginning of human history that Kant speaks about the sovereignty of the human being, but it is very much present in his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, his critique of practical reason, where humanity has to legislate itself. It has to also treat itself as an end, as an ultimate end, and human beings cannot instrumentalize themselves. And this can be termed as what Alan Wood calls the personification principle. And here, humanity is certainly not understood from a physical perspective or a biological perspective, but it is rather the rational perspective of the ability to formulate laws, moral laws. So Kant's ethical theory is, as Wood puts it, notoriously anthropocentric. But one sees a certain disquiet with this that emerges from the environmental camp, such as Tom Regan, Paul Taylor, and we see Chakravarti we can see Chakravarti as a part of this camp. For Kant, the responsibility to non-human beings in his earlier writings involves non-injury, and the preservation is also there, the preservation of nature argument, but this is all indirect. In fact, he mentions that the duties we may have with respect to non-rational beings are so because human beings mistake the duties that they have to themselves by transferring it to them. So, by not injuring animals or by abandoning them after, or not abandoning them, one cultivates a certain sensitivity for moral obligations to human beings. So, moral responsibility requires that one is, in a way, oriented to the human upliftment, the human moral upliftment, and this is clearly an anthropocentric perspective. One can read the stewardship argument, the human perfection argument in this, but then it remains anthropocentric because these are very human-oriented perspective. So is this all there is to Kant? This is the question. Now, David Baumeister has argued for reading this relationship in a different way. The human nature relationship is not one of rupture, as Chakravarti puts it, but it is rather an inevitable and an indispensable part of human life. So as long as one is human, one is also rational, one is also natural, physical, and both in a way have to be together in everything we do. So there is an inherent division within the human being. It is not, this division need not be read as a separation, but then the division persists, and it is via this division that there is there are moral judgments made and so forth. And Baumeister also suggests a very interesting metaphor. He suggests that we read this as a metaphor of along the lines of the metaphor of an axis, which is differentiated loci, but then they are nevertheless, they are bipolar also, but they have a certain continuity with one another, a continuity which we cannot abandon. Now, I would agree with Baumeister regarding the whole continuity part of the rational and the animal, something that he has underplayed or overlooked, not even underplayed, he has overlooked this completely, Chakravarti. And in this respect, one can revisit Paul Guer's essay from 1991 regarding Kant's account of duties to non-human nature, non-human beings. And here Guyer gives a very detailed account of how Kant makes a transition from his pre-critical stage of looking at these duties as grounded in the duty to human beings, that we need to preserve and look after nature only so that human beings have the resources left, which is the distribution argument that Chakravarti gives us. However, there is much more to Kant subsequently, particularly in his critique of judgment. And as Guyer notes in the metaphysics of morals as well, that we have duties to non-human nature because, not because of its instrumental value, but because of its aesthetic value, that natural beauty is a response. We respond to nature and we can make an aesthetic, reflective aesthetic judgment of beauty. And when we do that, we tend to encourage the tendency in ourselves, the proclivity in ourselves to become moral beings. So the aesthetic appreciation of nature leads, especially when it becomes a habit, as Kant notes, I quote here from Critique of Judgment, is always a mark of a good soul. So it has this, it motivates us to become moral, and human appreciation of natural beauty is grounded not in the duty to have useful objects for humanity, but in the duty for moral perfection within oneself, which is in turn grounded in the aesthetic value. I think it is done, right? Sorry, I just suggest at the end that we also need to look at how nature is like a work of art for Kant, in the sense that the spontaneity that we see in a work of art, we see in nature, and hence the utilitarianism that is attributed to Kant by Chakravarti is not quite such a strong and a very sort of objective reading of Kant. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Kanchana, for that critical engagement that you brought in with Kant and nature. I now request Apar Kumar. Apar Kumar is an associate professor of philosophy at Ahmedabad University. His research interests include Kant's model philosophy and Kant's theory of self-consciousness. He has published his works on Kant in Journal of Value Inquiry, Contexto Kantianos, and Kantian Review. He will now present his paper titled Kant's Transcendental Strategy and the Notion of Coordination. Apar.
Thanks, and Professor Raghuram Raju. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
I'd like to share my screen if I could. Okay, so
I will raise my hand after 15 minutes.
let me see. Okay, I think I am able to. Okay, so I have a handout, and it's a sort of longish piece, which I hope to finish within the time allotted to me. But what I'll do is I'm not going to refer to the handout, but I will sort of mark the numbers. So I'll announce the numbers so that you can sort of follow it, follow the argument on the handout. But apart from that, I'll just read it. So I argue, that's the claim, I argue that Heidegger's interpretation of Kant's transcendental inquiry as an immanent ontology, which describes the reciprocal relationship between concepts and intuitions, has, at least prima facie, some textual basis. Section 1, Heidegger's interpretation of Kant's transcendental strategy. A. P.F. Strawson and Graham Bird interpret Kant's transcendental methodology as a descriptive metaphysics, that is, quote, a mapping of the a priori structure immanent in our experience and constitutive of it, end of quote. And this is Bird's formulation. Like Strawson and Bird, Heidegger interprets Kant's transcendental method as a systematic description of the a priori conditions of the possibility of objects for a finite subject, or what he calls immanent ontology. But unlike Strawson and Bird, he emphasizes the notion of reciprocity in understanding Kant's transcendental strategy, as I now show. B. Heidegger takes Kant's claim that the, quote, proud name of ontology, end of quote, should be replaced by transcendental philosophy as merely a rejection of of traditional ontology that, quote unquote, presumes the knowledge of synthetic a priori propositions and not a rejection of ontology in itself. If Heidegger says ontology, quote, takes off its pride, that is, grasps itself as the necessary structure of the essence of finitude, then the expression ontology will have been given its true essence for the first time, end of quote. So Heidegger conceives of Kant's transcendental project as an immanent rather than a transcendent ontology, and thinks that this is also Kant's own conception of ontology. And he cites KRB 845, A845, B873. C. For Heidegger, Kant provides an immanent ontology of transcendence. Now, this is Heidegger using transcendence in his own way, or the conditions for the possibility of the relationship between the finite subject and its object. C1. Heidegger characterizes transcendence as the, quote, basic faculty of a turning toward which lets something stand in opposition. In this original turning toward, the finite creature first allows a space for play, Spielraum, within which something can correspond to it. To hold oneself in advance in such a play space or Spielraum, to form it originally, is none other than transcendence, which marks all finite comportment of beings, end of quote. In this passage, the subject is able to put itself in opposition to something apart from itself, that is, any object. Any knowledge that the subject might acquire can correspond to this object only if this turning toward the object is possible for the subject. C2. The description of the conditions for the possibility of experience is the, quote, unified wholeness of what finite knowledge makes possible in its essence. That is, it circumscribes transcendence in its full essential whole, end of quote. That's what Heidegger says. C3. This description is no different from Heidegger's characterization of ontology, which is, quote, none other than the explicit unveiling of the systematic whole of pure knowledge to the extent it forms transcendence, end of quote. C4. Hence, for Heidegger, Kant offers an immanent ontology of transcendence, or a description of the conditions for the possibility of the experience of the finite subject. D. What sort of description does the immanent ontology of transcendence provide? According to Heidegger, the specific descriptive content of immanent ontology is reciprocal, or is the reciprocal relationship between concept and intuition. Synthesis, Heidegger says, is the, quote, reciprocal gegenseitig, being ready for one another, end of quote, of pure concept and pure intuition. The fitting together, or, quote, the essential unity, Wesenseinheit, end of quote, of pure concepts and pure intuitions entails that each takes the place allocated to it in relation to the other. And here he uses the word fugen, which I'll talk about a little more. The fitting together or essential unity of pure concepts and pure intuitions entails that each takes the place allocated to it in relation to the other, and each, quote, structurally requires for that the other, end of quote. The essential unity, quote, shows seams, fugen is the word he uses, which point to the fact that they have been reciprocally put together in advance, end of quote. E. Hence, from, well, there's no E, so this is just a summary of what I've just said. Hence, for Heidegger's Kant, immanent ontology is the description of the conditions for the possibility of experience that circumscribes transcendence in its essential wholeness. This space of transcendence consists in an, quote, essential and reciprocal unity, end of quote, of pure concepts and pure intuitions, a, quote, fitting together that has been put together in advance such that each of these elements structurally requires the others in a unified order. Section 2. Section 2. I argue that if we take into account Kant's little discussed notion of coordination, then Heidegger's claims that Kant's transcendental philosophy is an immanent ontology, and that the descriptive content of Kant's immanent ontology is the reciprocal relationship between concepts and intuitions, can be said to get something right about Kant's transcendental strategy. So basically, I'm saying that if you focus on this notion of coordination, you see that Heidegger is sort of on the right track when he interprets Kant's transcendental philosophy as an immanent ontology. 2.1, the features of coordination. Now, in Reflections from the Silent Period, Kant uses the term coordination to characterize the reciprocal tying together of elements into a system in general and cognition in particular. A. Kant says there are two types of tying together, Verknüpfung, right? Subordination and coordination. B. Coordinative tying together is reciprocal combination. Kant says, quote, all tying together has a ground. Nexus of subordination, colon, through ground. Nexus of coordination, colon, through reciprocal ground, end of quote. Similarly, in another passage, he says that, quote, everything combined has a reciprocal ground, end of quote. In these passages, the term Gemeinschaft is best translated as reciprocal, given that Kant himself connects community or Gemeinschaft and reciprocity in glossing the third category of relation in the Critique of Pure Reason. Quote, the relation of community, which he glosses as reciprocal relation, that is Wechselwirkung between the active and the passive. C. Coordination is an aspect of systematic unity. Knowing the complete essence of a thing is to know the coordination of the inner determinations of that thing in relation to each other. Kant says, and I quote, the complete fundamental concept of a thing is the essence. The Grundbegriff, or the thing, the fundamental concept, is the completion of the subordination of the inner determinations. Its completeness is the completion of coordination of inner determinations, end of quote. So coordination is a particular relationship between elements in a systematic unity. D. Cognition for Kant is one such systematic unity. Kant says again, I quote, all cognition has two sorts of combination, Verbindung, right? Coordination and subordination. The former, coordination, is such that it involves, it naturally occurs in origination, or wherein the combination can, in the final instance, be broken down into parts and put together back again, end of quote. The term zusammensetzen, set together or coordinated, combined with the claim that coordination is a reciprocal tying together, means that for Kant, cognition, construed as a systematic unity, involves a reciprocal tying together of its elements. So coordination is a reciprocal tying together of elements within a system. This coordinative tying together relates to the faculty of the understanding rather than the faculty of reason. Kant says that in all empirical cognition, quote, if one leaves aside appearance, Erscheinung, then sensation or Empfindung remains. And if one leaves aside sensation, then pure concepts remain. And in these pure concepts, he includes pure concepts of the understanding, which relate to coordination, and pure concepts of reason, which relates to subordination. End of quote. Here, the faculty of reason is supposed to subordinate concepts into a genus-species framework, while coordination relates to pure concepts of the understanding. Hence, from A and D, Kant coordination refers to the reciprocal tying together of elements in a systematic unity. Cognition, as one such systematic unity, relates to the coordination of pure concepts of the understanding. F on the handout. Kant does not explicitly use the term coordination in the first critique. However, the notion of coordination construed as the reciprocal tying together of elements in a unified ordered totality is implicit in Kant's characterization of systematicity and transcendental philosophy in the critique of pure reason, and the claim, and as is the claim that concepts are reciprocally related to intuitions. So coordination he doesn't use in the first critique, but both these claims, when he's discussing systematicity and when he's discussing the relationship between concepts and intuition, there is the notion of coordination that is present. 2.2. Heidegger's claim that for Kant, transcendental philosophy is immanent ontology has some textual basis for the following reason. A. Kant says that transcendental philosophy is not so much concerned with the object, Gegenstand, as with the a priori concepts of objects in generals, and that, quote, a system of such concepts is transcendental philosophy, end of quote. This is A 1112. B, the ideas of coordination and description are implicit in Kant's characterization of systematicity in the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant states, quote, and this is the passage that I'm going to now discuss, the sum total in Begriff of its, that is the pure understandings, cognition, Erkenntnis, constitutes a system that is to be grasped and determined under one idea, end of quote. And the system's, quote, completeness and articulation can, however, provide at the same time a touchstone for correctness and genuineness of all fitted together, hineinpassend is the word that he uses, bits of cognition. Right. So just once more, right? And the system's completeness and articulation, articulation is the word, can, however, provide at the same time a touchstone of correctness and genuineness of all fitted together, hineinpassend bits of cognition, end of quote. In this passage, one, a system, so I'm now commenting on this particular passage. One, the system is a unified totality, and so its unity must, at least in part, be considered coordinative, since coordination as an aspect of systematicity relates to the completeness of inner determinations of a system. Two, the term hineinpassend or fitting together suggests the idea of coordination as reciprocal tying together, as does the term articulation or articulation that strictly means the fitting together of elements. For instance, the way bones fit together in a living body. Three, but articulation here also implies description, given that Kant says that system must serve as a, quote, touchstone for correctness and genuineness of cognition, end of quote, which of course then presupposes a description of the system. Four, therefore, from 1 to 3, the three claims that I've made in commenting on this passage, one can argue that for Kant, transcendental philosophy is a systematic description of the coordination or complete reciprocal tying together of a priori concepts of the finite understanding. Because of course, he's talking about, it's in the analytic and he's talking about the finite understanding. So C, but this way of conceiving Kant's transcendental philosophy is consistent with what Heidegger calls immanent ontology, that is the description of the conditions for the possibility of experience that, quote, circumscribes transcendence in its full essential wholeness, end of quote, where transcendence, of course, for Heidegger means a reciprocal unity of concepts and intuitions. Therefore, at least at first sight, Heidegger's Kant interpretation seems to get one aspect of Kant's transcendental strategy right, that it is a kind of a immanent ontology, right? Or at least that's what I'm claiming right now in a prima facie, right? Because this is just one person. There are other passages. 2.3, Heidegger's claim that the descriptive content of Kant's transcendental inquiry is the reciprocal relationship between concepts and intuitions in cognition also has some textual basis in Kant. A, at KRV B1145, this is a mistake there, it should be 1145. Kant says that the categories of unity, truth, and perfection must not be connected as done by the scholastics to the thing in itself. Instead, these categories of the understanding, here the category of quality, should be, quote, used in a merely formal sense as belonging to the logical requirements of every cognition, end of quote. In explicating what it means to use these categories formally, Kant implicitly presupposes that cognition is the reciprocal relationship between concepts and intuitions, as I now suggest. 1. This was A, now 1 in A. Kant says that in each cognition of an object, there is a, quote, unity of concept, which is thought as the qualitative unity of the putting together, Zusammenfassung, of the manifold of cognition, like, say, the unity of the theme in a play, a speech, or a fable, end of quote. This is a famous passage, actually. This suggests that for Kant, cognition via a unified concept presupposes a concept of reciprocal relationality, since elements in, say, a fable must relate to each other reciprocally. That is, each element of the fable structurally requires all its other elements. 2. The truth of cognition depends on the intuitional consequences. The greater the consequences, and here he's talking about the subcategory of truth, the truth of cognition depends on the intuitional consequences. The greater the consequences of a concept, the more the marks of its objective reality. According to Kant, this, quote, qualitative plurality of marks belongs to a concept as to a common ground, gemeinschaftlichen Grund, end of quote. Here, the relationship between the unified concept and the multiple consequences of this concept can be seen as reciprocal because Kant uses the word or term gemeinschaftlich to specify this relationship, and Gemeinschaft for Kant, as I had mentioned earlier, implies reciprocal relationality as I had said in 2.1b. 3. Now, the third subcategory of perfection, right? Cognitive perfection or completeness requires relating the plurality of the intuitional consequences of a concept to the unity of that particular concept as opposed to any other concept. Perfection, Kant says, and I quote, consists in leading back of the plurality to the unity of the concept, and this plurality is fitted together, zusammenstimmen is the word that he uses here, with this and no other concept fully, and this one can call the qualitative completeness or the totality, which is Vollständigkeit, totalität is another word it uses. Here in this, when you now talk about the subcategory of perfection, here the fitted togetherness or the fitted together can refer to the reciprocal or coordinative relationship between the unique set of consequences of a particular complete concept that distinguishes it from other concepts, since, as indicated in section 2.1, coordination of inner determinations of a systematic unity makes for completeness. This is something that he said that clearly in the reflection that I quoted earlier. Hence, 4. Hence, from 1 to 3, so this was the comment on this particular passage, B11415. The summary of what I've just said. So hence, from 1 to 3, cognition involves the reciprocal coordinative relationship between a unified concept and a manifold of intuition, such that every element of the manifold is reciprocally related to every other element. This was number 1. The intuitional consequences of a concept are reciprocally related to the unity of that particular concept. And so a greater reciprocal fit between concept and intuition entails greater knowledge of the object, greater cognition. Finally, a unified concept, and this was number 2. Finally, a unified concept is cognitionally perfect or complete if the manifold of intuition subsumed under this concept makes for this concept alone, as opposed to any other concept. That's perfection, subcategory of perfection. Hence, for Kant, the concept-intuition relationship can be viewed as a reciprocal or a coordinative relationship. And that's what I'm trying to say in this particular subsection 2.3. Now, for Heidegger, or for Heidegger's Kant, the space of transcendence is also, as I said earlier, the reciprocal unity between pure concepts and pure intuitions, or fitting together, put together in advance, such that each of the elements, so it's put together in advance, such that each of the elements involved structurally requires the other. So basically, I've shown that there is some evidence that the relationship between concepts and intuitions is reciprocal in Kant, which is the way Heidegger is interpreting Kant's notion of cognition. Therefore, Heidegger's interpretation of the descriptive content, which is the relationship between cognition and relationship between concepts and intuition of Kant's transcendental inquiry, has at least some textual basis. In sum, I have argued that there is at least prima facie some textual basis for at least 2 aspects of Heidegger's, and I know what he says about the imagination and how controversial that is, but at least in these 2 aspects, the claim that Kant is offering us an immanent ontology and that the descriptive content of this particular immanent ontology is a coordinative concept-intuition relationship, is something that Heidegger's Kant interpretation gets right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Apar, for the very interesting distinction that you brought between 2 kinds of 2 dimensions about coordination and subordination in this relationship. And now I request that our next speaker is Nishad Patnaik. Nishad teaches philosophy at IIT Delhi. His broad interests include Kant's transcendental idealism, its comparative connection with Husserl's phenomenology, the idea of modernity. His publications include his latest book on modernity and its future past. His recent work has been on developing a phenomenological reading of the transcendental direction in Kant's first critique. He will now speak on transcendental logic and method in the first critique. Nishad.
Thank you so much, Professor Raghuram Raju, and it's a pleasure being here, and thank you to the organizers and especially to Vivek for putting this very interesting panel together. So let me just share. I just have some quotes on the PPT, so I'll just share that. Okay, so my approach to the first critique, and particularly the transcendental deduction, is more along I try and unearth the phenomenology within that. So I try and read Kant in a somewhat more dynamic manner than is usually kind of presented as the standard understanding of Kant in terms of this epistemic question of the a priori applicability of the categories to possible experience. So I try and pass that out in a more dynamic phenomenological manner. So this is part of that attempt. So okay. So in the study, I introduced Kant's conception of transcendental logic qua critique, understood as a modal category initially through the problem that arises as soon as he articulates it in a set of categories, following the guiding thread of the judgment forms. The problem consists in determining the a priori completeness of the latter, that is of the judgment forms, and thus of the categories. By taking into consideration some criticisms of the metaphysical deduction, I argue that the apparent reconfiguration of the analytic-synthetic divide in Kant's own methodological procedure that the problem of completeness seems to imply is due to an overly restricted conception of analysis and synthesis. A broader processive methodological conception sheds light on the possibility of the transition from general to transcendental logic. I argue that it is the explicit reflective performance in third order modalized judgments of the judgment forms obtained through the discursive analysis of experience in second order analytic judgments that enables this transition in the transcendental deduction. These higher order judgments uncover the implicit synthetic a priori intuitive content of the judgment forms themselves, hence the possibility and types of synthetic a priori knowledge in the schematized categories as functions of space-time. Once this thesis is established, the methodological necessity of Kant's point of departure in the analytically abstracted forms of judgment and how they can serve as a guiding thread emerges more clearly. For the starting point in the discursive analysis of experience is itself understood in terms of the spatio-temporal discursivity of finite cognition. In keeping with this discursivity, I underscore the necessarily reflective and retrospective methodological movement of the critique, from the judgment forms to the categories, by pointing to the role of modality in the transcendental deduction. This spatio-temporal discursivity and the reflective, retrospective methodological orientation it implies clarifies the sense in which the methodological question is inseparable from the possibility of a transcendental logical critique qua modalization. So this is the first section, the problem of completeness of the categories. The question of the completeness of Kant's categories, along with the procedure for their deduction, has long troubled commentators. Kant asserts that Aristotle, lacking any principle of deduction, arrives at his categories rhapsodically as and when he comes across them in experience. Any such procedure is incapable of providing a rational basis for maintaining that the categories represent an exhaustive enumeration of the pure concepts of the understanding. In contrast, Kant claims that his table of categories is systematically developed from a common principle, namely the capacity for judgment. Yet, without further explanation, Kant introduces the table of judgments, complete and fully articulated, as the guiding thread for the discovery of the categories. Moreover, he admits that these judgment forms are adapted from the Aristotelian logical heritage. This seems to leave Kant vulnerable to the very charge he makes against Aristotle. Hegel, for instance, writes, this is the quote, I won't read it out, but it's there in front of you. So thus Hegel says, we arrive at an empirical logic, an irrational science of the rational. If the logical forms of judgment provide the guiding thread to the discovery of all the pure concepts of the understanding, the obvious question is, how did these forms themselves arise and what guarantees their completeness and systematic unity? Heidegger expresses similar reservations with respect to the metaphysical deduction. For Heidegger, the problem of completeness reflects Kant's attempt to isolate the elements of pure knowledge. The impossibility of such isolation shows the artificiality of his point of departure. Kant, however, maintains his claim concerning the systematic derivation of the categories via the clue of the judgment forms on the grounds that this is the crux of the metaphysical deduction. I'll read this out. The same function which gives unity to various representations in a judgment also gives unity to the mere synthesis of various representations in an intuition. And this unity we entitle the pure concept of the understanding. The same understanding through the same operations by which in concepts, by means of analytic unity, it produces a logical form of judgment, also introduces a transcendental content into its representations by means of the synthetic unity of the manifold of intuitions in general. On this account, we are entitled to call these representations pure concepts of the understanding and to regard them as applying a priori to objects, a conclusion which general logic is not in a position to establish. So from this, he concludes there arise exactly, etc., etc. So this is his argument, and this is the claim to completeness which is under question. However, this explanation seems to escape the charge of empiricism only by begging the question, where not only the sameness of the functions between judgments and pure concepts, but also the completeness of the table of judgments as providing an, quote, exhaustive inventory, end quote, of the capacities or functions of the understanding is presupposed. It would appear that the table is already formulated with a view to analytically deriving the categories as a priori functions identical with the logical functions of judgment. If the latter are understood as forming an interderivable systematic whole, then it requires only a short step to arrive at the systematicity and a priori completeness of the categories themselves. It seems then that the divide between a priori analysis and empirical synthesis reappears in Kant's own method as the only two reductive possibilities for the transition to the categories via the logical forms of functions of judgment. Consequently, the idea of a transcendental logic, that the possibility of this transition is to open up, the very logic that purports to undercut the absolute character of the analytic-synthetic divide, seems to be undermined. However, Kant's claim that the understanding produces the logical forms of judgment in concepts by means of analytic unity does not mean that the judgments, according to those forms, are analytical in the sense of expressing a relation of formal inclusion, or, quote, that one intellectual activity, analysis, is being contrasted with another, synthesis. This is Allison's quote. Rather, quote, both analytic and synthetic judgments involve the unification, that is synthesis, of representations in one consciousness, and the logical functions of judgment are the forms or modes of this unification. Kant indicates then this when he attributes the analytic-synthetic distinction to the content, that is the epistemic grounds, that is the modality based on contingent empirical association or necessity for the connection or synthesis of concepts, rather than the form of judgment. This is prolegomena. Allison notes two purportedly equivalent versions of the distinction, one based on containment or identity of the subject and object concepts in analytic judgments, and the other explicative, as opposed to ampliative or synthetic. The latter, again, does not add anything through the predicate to the subject concept, but breaks it up into its constituent concepts. The first formulation raises several difficulties. How do we determine whether one concept is contained in another? The phenomenological criterion, that is introspection, appears merely subjective at this point. Yet the logical criterion, that is contradiction, cannot be applied. We cannot determine whether the contradictory of a given judgment is self-contradictory without recourse to phenomenological considerations, that is, insight into the meanings of terms, which determine if one concept is contained in another. The second formulation is more productive insofar as it suggests that analytic and synthetic judgments differ in their epistemic functions. The former formally extends our knowledge, while the latter extends it materially. This suggests that the distinction is not confined to judgments of the categorical form, but is applicable across any series of immediate or mediate inferences, that is judgments, whatever its logical form. This second formulation affords the possibility of raising the question of the status of the logical functions of judgments themselves, along with the logical relations between them, which are a priori, which are supposed to be a priori, and yet, since they serve an epistemic function, also synthetic. It should be kept in mind that judgment is the basic cognitive activity of the understanding for Kant. It is not confined to the combination of given concepts or judgments, but gives rise to determinate representations, that is, concepts, whether empirical or a priori, in the first place. As Allison notes, quote, every act of judgment is also an act of conceptualization and vice versa, end quote. Thus, concepts as products of judgmental synthesis unite in a single representation, marks, or a mark that pertains to many representations, such that much possible knowledge is collected into one, and are therefore analytic unities. This holds irrespective of whether the judgment itself is analytic or synthetic, since it is the same operation of synthesis that brings a representation, whether immediate, that is an intuition, or mediated conceptually under a higher representation, thereby providing determinate cognitive representation. Further, every judgmental synthesis is a function of unity. That is, it embodies a certain form. The forms of judgment are the various possible ways in which representations, irrespective of their origin, may be united. Thus, at least one of the logical functions under each heading, quantity, quality, relation, and modality, is involved in any judgment. In other words, to explicate this a little less formally, in other words, since we make judgments, again of a certain form, not only with respect to concepts, such as this is a tree, but judgments themselves, this is a tree is of the form S is P, and even the forms of judgment, all SSP is a universal, categorical, esoteric, affirmative judgment. It is the synthetic a priori status of these higher order logical judgments that is at issue. The judgment forms then are specific modes of the underlying unifying principle of the understanding, its forms of analysis that point back to its functions of synthesis, which, as a unified interconnected system, constitute their a priori ground. So Kant says, when a science is an aggregate brought into existence in a merely experimental manner, such completeness can never be guaranteed. It is possible only by means of an idea of the totality of the a priori knowledge yielded by the understanding. Such an idea can furnish an exact classification of the concepts which compose that totality, exhibiting their interconnection in a system. Thus, the productive aspect of synthetic activity must necessarily be posited as temporally prior to its discursive or analytic aspect. Kant again emphasizes this order of dependence at the beginning of the B deduction. This action is originally one and holds equally for all combination, and its dissolution, namely analysis, which appears to be its opposite, yet always presupposes it. For where the understanding has not previously combined, it cannot dissolve, since only as having been combined by the understanding can anything that allow of analysis be given to the faculty of representation. Thus, although the movement of the metaphysical deduction is from general to transcendental logic, it is made possible only through the presupposition of the categories as synthetic functions, but also it is made possible not only through the presupposition of the categories, but also of their completeness according to the a priori idea of the unity of the understanding. However, if this presupposition is not to generate a vicious circle, the modal, that is phenomenological distinction between the synthetic activity of judgment at the level of concept formation and general logic, that is the forms of judgment, and transcendental logic must always be kept in mind. Such a modal account would explicate the possibility of the judgment forms serving as a guiding thread by showing that they must implicitly possess synthetic a priori content. This content is made explicit in the categories, that is in their schematism, via higher order reflective synthetic a priori judgments, what Allison calls schema judgments, accomplished through pure intuition of the a priori, that is spatio-temporal forms of possible experience, or the forms of intuition. Such pure self-intuition involves a reflective synthetic, this is the phenomenological angle, and of course I can't develop this here, but this is how I read the transcendental deduction. Such pure self-intuition involves a reflective synthetic performance in the I think of the formal possibilities of synthesis afforded by the a priori unity of space and time as the pure forms of intuition. So if general and transcendental logic are concerned with the same functions of the understanding, which they analyze at different levels, then this difference in levels and the possibility of the transition from the former to the latter involves a modal transformation according to the categories of modality, a reflective synthetic constitutive judging in the transcendental deduction that relates them to the spatio-temporal unity of self-experience. In this manner, what is brought to conceptual representation in the schematized categories is the pure synthesis of representation itself according to the a priori forms of all intuition. So this is the, By means of analysis, different representations are brought under one concept, a procedure treated of in general logic. What transcendental logic, on the other hand, teaches is how we bring to concepts not representations, but the pure synthesis of representation. Without this transcendental logical critique, which I'm reading as a modalization of general logic, as the problem of completeness shows, the epistemic status of the judgment forms remains intuitively opaque. The single principle from which the judgment functions and the categories are derived, ensuring their completeness, is the unity of consciousness. Yet the latter constitutes such a principle only insofar as it is a synthetically performed unity. Okay, so you can see the phenomenological, more dynamic idea here. Hence made manifest in its subjection to the spatio-temporal form of all finite synthesis. So the transcendental deduction accomplishes precisely such an explicit synthetic reflective performance or judging that in and through the spatio-temporal schematization of the categories makes the latter manifest as specific functions of time and space. The latter, therefore, as the a priori forms of intuition, entail both the a priori applicability of the categories to possible experience as well as their completeness. Thus, what the transcendental logic represents is third-order modal judgments that involve the formal or pure intuition, which I'm kind of interpreting as reflective intuitive performance of the pure forms of intuition in their determining function of possible experience or schematism. So the idea is that this third order modal judgments, they're formal intuitions of the form of space and time itself. Right? So Kant makes a distinction between form of intuition and formal intuition. Right? So ultimately where it comes together is the formal intuition of the forms of space and time. That's where the schematism arises from.
Nishant, can you take 1 or 2 minutes to find it?
Yeah, I'm done. Thanks a lot.
Oh, yeah,
Thank
sorry. Thank you. Sorry.
No.
Yes. Thank you very much. It's a very intense sessions, 4 presentations. Are very, very interesting. Without taking much time, I open all 4 presentations for question and answer.
I think Karen has a
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yes. Thank you for all of your presentations. I thought it was very interesting. I have various questions. So my first question is for Vivek. And in particular, I was interested in this first translation of the Critique of Pure Reason by Müller. And I was wondering to what extent the, let's say, the classical Indian tradition or classical Indian epistemology had an impact on the vocabulary and so on. And also more generally, I was wondering to what extent certain positions developed within classical Indian philosophy chime in with Kant or are very different. And I think that that's, well, there was very little discussion of this theme in the presentations more generally. Yeah, so maybe we can pick up on this a little in the Q&A. Yeah, so, well, I think my point is clear. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. No, I mean, one of the things is, I mean, we know that the first translation, I think, happened in 1838. It was by Francis Heywood. And then, Michael A. John's translation is quite well known. That came out in 1855. But unfortunately, these translations were not available to Indian thinkers here. It happened so that it was Max Muller's translation that came in 1881 that reached the Indian thinkers. And this is evident from a number of writings of including the writings of Vivekananda and K.C. Bhattacharya. They refer to Max Muller's translations. So we know that Max Muller, was an Indologist. He was here. He translated some of the classical Indian texts and also translated European philosophies to India. And so eventually, it looks like the way this translation resonated with the Indian thinkers. It happened so that they resonated in the form of certain classical traditions in Indian philosophy, specifically Advaita Vedanta. And that is the reason why I mentioned that Kant was received with some tinge of British idealism. There is a flavor of British idealism that was there when Indians received Kant. And this resonated with Indian philosophers, particularly because they were also interested in some of the classical traditions, especially Advaita Vedanta. So one of the themes that sort of could have resonated with them is this idea of absolute, the idea of phenomenal nominal distinction, and the search for the a priori principles themselves, right? And so that could have sort of resonated with some of the Indian thinkers. And again, we see this repeatedly in some of the writings of 20th century Indian thinkers. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah.
Others want to respond to this question?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
No, other speakers, if they want to respond to this. Or any other questions? Yeah, Henry. It's Henry wants. Before you warm up, I wanted to ask this following question to Vivek. When you have narrated, listed the way in which Kant was received in India. Now, do you want us to look at it as a historical, presentation, or what kind of seriousness do you want to assign to these, what Kant said on India? because that would make what Kant said in India, more relevant to it.
Okay. So one of the things, I mean, it was also out of a personal interest because I've been reading Kant for a while, and I thought it was, necessary that I know the directions that Indian thinkers have taken before me in Kant's philosophy, and that is the reason why I started this, research. And no, I don't know. I mean, frankly, I've been looking at how the Indian thinkers have received Kantian philosophy in India, and how the different directions that they have taken. I don't know if I should be suggesting a direction in which Kant should be read, or I don't know if other Indian philosophers here should be suggesting how Kant should be read, because now with as I mentioned, with easy access to the translations of Kant's works, and also with increasing or ever increasing Anglo-Indian Kant scholarship, we have a number of scholars, including the ones here who have been working on Kant in different directions. So I think, I mean, I'm still observing, and I do hope to observe and then take a step forward to that.
Others, yeah. Speaker can ask questions to other speakers. Yeah, please, please.
Yeah,
please.
okay. Yeah, great. That was really interesting, and I also have several questions. I'll make maybe two. One of them is to Kanchana, and the other to Nishad. So to Kanchana, I was wondering how you read Kant, because you presented Chakrabarti criticism, and you said that he focuses mostly on one specific text and he doesn't really engage with the third critique. And you said that maybe if we engage with the third critique, maybe we can find a different perspective that Kant would have in relation to these environmental issues. So I was wondering, do you think that there is a tension between what Kant does in the third critique and what he does in other texts? Or do you think that he's just approaching the issue from different perspectives, and that these perspectives could, in the end, maybe be compatible with one another? It's just that he's focusing on the question from different perspectives. So that is my question to Kanchana. And to Nishad, I thought it was very interesting, and I was wondering if you could speak more. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understood you correctly, you're claiming that maybe the key to solve the completeness issue is to explore a little bit further the relationship between apperception and the table of judgments, and you claimed that perhaps you mentioned this notion of performance and performativity and so on, and I was wondering if you can explain a little bit more what you mean by that, because I also study Fichte, and I see some connections, some similarities there, and if you could explain a little bit more what you mean by performance, and how do you think that this the relationship between apperception and judgments could offer the key to solve the completeness problem. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. May I answer the question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So yeah, this is an important point, that is it that Kant said different things and he simply had different perspectives? What is it? I do think that no, my answer would be no, that it is not a case of different perspectives, but that in his later writings, one sees a greater and greater tendency to think about nature and a non-instrumental way, and that non-instrumental way is an aesthetic way. So one cannot simply attribute his arguments from the speculative history text to Kant per se, and to think of Kant as emblematizing a kind of an anti-environmental sensitivity, but rather when one reads the critique of judgment, one does see there the argument given by Paul Guyer that there is a certain psychology that underlies which is the aesthetics, which is that of receiving nature in an aesthetic way. So there is a kind of the subjective reception of nature as aesthetic that matters, which leads to a certain responsibility to nature. But then at this, the part that I could not complete was that there is also a certain claim he makes about nature per se, not just the human capacity to receive nature as aesthetic, but that nature itself is like a work of art, and that there is nature gives the rule to art. For example, when he says this, that art draws from the spontaneity of nature, and well, nature draws from the so-called intentionality of art. But when he speaks about the idea of a purposiveness without a purpose, I have a critique of that, that this cannot just be understood along the model of the techne, which takes us back to the kind of problematic that Chakrabarti brings in. So perhaps abandoning the idea of purposiveness without purpose would be good. So yeah, there is a contradiction perhaps in the earlier and the later perspectives, and within certain texts, even the ethical texts, there are some contradictions, and one needs to read, I would say, tensions. Also, I would use the word tension, and one should pay attention to those tensions and not just abandon Kant completely. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, yeah. So I couldn't really develop that, but this idea of performance and enaction of the synthesis, which is subject to space and time, right? So the idea is that this an active element in Kant, which is judging itself, is not arbitrary, but it gives synthetic intuitive content to the forms of judgment via the schematization of the categories, precisely because in judging, in the sort of transcendental deduction, it becomes clear that we come to an awareness of our own subjection to the a priori forms of intuition, namely space and time. Time more than space, but I also have because Kant, of course, prioritizes temporality over spatiality, at least in the first critique, in the aesthetic. But I also have an argument for saying why space becomes kind of cannot be abandoned completely, because there's a spatialization of time, or our temporal synthesis, which allows for, determinate, conceptually determinate representation to emerge in the first place, right? So all those passages where he says that you cannot draw a line without representing it, as a line in a straight outside yourself and so on, those are the spatializations of temporal synthesis. Although in the aesthetic, he prioritizes time, temporal synthesis over space, because spatial representation is temporally synthesized, obviously. But nonetheless, there's a spatialization of time as well. So these two, and then, so that's the kind of hinge on the basis of which I claim that in doing this temporal synthesis, which is a performance, we become aware of our own subjection to the a priori forms of space and time. And that's what prevents this synthesis from being a mere kind of arbitrary construction. Then, of course, we could put anything together.
Thank you.
Okay, so that would be the line of argument.
I have, if you don't have a question, I have a question to Apar. this point that you made about coordination and subordination is of a very important, point. I wanted to ask you whether it is possible to, extend it and inhabit it within the political context of egalitarianism and its opposite. Because coordination, there is a possibility of egalitarianism, whereas subordination has hierarchy, one form of hierarchy. So, are there any politics that you find, in this distinction?
Not really, actually. Because subordination is the way Kant talks about it, it's relates to the genus-species framework, right? So genus and species, that's the way he's thinking of subordination, and he's thinking of that in relation to the faculty of reason. I'm trying to say that when he's thinking of the faculty of the understanding, he says explicitly, he's thinking through this notion of coordination. And that coordination is the way to understand his transcendental strategy. Because ultimately, it's a methodology, right? I mean, how, or at least it's, let me not say it's the only way, it's one key way to understand his transcendental methodology. So I'm working purely with epistemological and metaphysical issues here, and I don't know if this is going to be useful. It may be useful in some logical sense, perhaps, in the political realm, but I'm not sure how that transition would be made at this point.
Any other question?
I think Karin has a
I
question.
think Karen has a
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yes. Thanks. Yes. I also have a question for Apar on this notion of coordination. I thought it was very interesting, but I also have some doubts. Yes, or at least I'd like to ask for further clarification, because you take one category that, according to Kant, is used in cases where we try to produce objective cognitions. Yeah, so he offers this example of the moon and the sun, where we somehow need to posit that the two are coordinated, and in a way constitute a whole. But then your point is that that Kant, in his own conception of the relationship between two faculties, somehow applies this category, but not for the purpose. Yes, so is this correct? Yes, that you say, look, Kant in his own transcendental philosophy is conceiving of intuition, or intuitions and concepts, or intuition as a capacity and the understanding as a capacity, as reciprocally related. So, and you take this to be a matter of coordination. That is to say, something that is similar to positing the community of two elements. And I think it's interesting, but it's also a bit hard to understand. Yeah, so because we know very little about the specific principles that Kant brings into play in his conception of the relation between the various faculties. So in a way, I like the idea, but I think we also need to take into account that what Kant is doing himself in the Critique of Pure Reason is very different from the type of cognition that he analyzes. Yes, that is to say, objective cognition. And so my question is quite general. Yes, so what do we know about Kant's own employment of specific categories in his own analysis, for instance, of the faculties? And I think you give us an example, but maybe you can say a bit more about the more general implications of your paper. Yeah. So what does it mean to attribute to Kant the employment of certain categories.
Okay, if I understand you correctly, let me first clarify something. Subordination, which is what goes with, you know, creating a genus species framework, which is goes with the faculty of reason, right? And reason, of course, as you know, completes the argument. Think of the syllogism in the beginning of the dialectic. So I'm not talking about the coordination at this point, although there is one, but I'm not talking at this point about the coordination between the faculties of reason and the faculty of understanding. Instead, I'm talking about the coordination between the faculty of understanding, which is what he says transcendental philosophy is a system of a priori concepts, right? The faculty of the understanding and the faculty of intuition. Right? And this is what Heidegger is saying, that this reciprocal relationship is a reciprocal relationship between pure concepts and pure intuitions. Right? And so of course, intuitions are going to go with the notion of sensibility. And of course, this B114115, I didn't have the time to present it, but after articulating this particular way of thinking about the three subcategories of quality, he also gives us an example there. He talks about hypothesis as actually exemplifying these three different cognition in relation to these three different subcategories of the category of quality, where he's much more explicit in terms of the intuitional element and so on. So the point I was trying to make right now was just that, first of all, it is a descriptive metaphysics of a certain sort. It's and more specifically, it's an immanent ontology, the way Heidegger means it, because if you look at Bird or Strawson, this element of reciprocity in actually Kant's own method is something that they don't, perhaps it's implicit, one could argue that it's implicit, but they don't focus on that, right? Heidegger, on the other hand, focuses on that. And in that sense, I'm saying he gets things right. And then once you have a kind of transcendental systematicity, which is a kind of coordination of all the elements, a complete system of a priori concepts, well, then you ask, what's the descriptive content of that? And for Heidegger, the descriptive content of that is this reciprocal relationship between concepts and intuitions. Right? I'm saying that if you look at this particular passage, B114115, well, that's exactly what Kant is doing. So in a sense, and 2 points here, right? In a sense, the notion of quality and the way he describes the category of quality, in some senses, is also, and I have to say much more about this, and I do have other evidence for this, is also a way of describing his own transcendental philosophy. And contextually, think of how he's putting this point there. He is trying to distinguish his, and as I quoted, this passage, he's trying to distinguish his own transcendental philosophy from that of the ancients. He says that, as opposed to the transcendental philosophy of the ancients, the Alten, right? My transcendental philosophy uses these categories in a merely formal sense, right? And then he gives you a way of thinking about cognition and mainly through this notion of quality. Now, there are many questions that sort of emerge here. What would be is there any direct evidence, for instance, that quality would be the key categories, methodologically a key category? Right, because that's the first point. And second, the other categories like reciprocity, right? And of course, that's part of relation. Is in a sense, it's already built into the argument that he's making in relation to this category of quality, which is also interesting, right? Right? He's sort of presuming, one could argue, one could actually make this argument. I mean, sort of read this passage by saying that, in a sense, he's including all the other passages, all the other categories in one way or the other, right? So then, how could he do that? How is it possible that he can sort of focus on the category of quality and then, in a sense, include also reciprocity, right? And so, therefore, he is, especially given the context, saying something methodological here. And so, the other part of the paper is to sort of take this reading and take it to the transcendental method, section on the transcendental method, and of course, several other reflections that I have thought about, I've sort of gathered. In the process of working out this paper. So it's not faculty of reason, faculty of understanding, it is faculty of reason and faculty of understanding and the faculty of sensibility that's at issue. And at this point, I'm only talking about, Heidegger's reading of Kant. And I think that, at least these two claims, Heidegger gets right.
Okay, if I can ask a follow-up question.
Sure.
I still, to be honest, I still don't really understand your position, I think, because in my view, it is not that clear that Kant himself is using any categories. Yes, so is using them. Yes, so I think at least I would distinguish more strictly between Kant's discussion of how the human mind actually employs categories to produce objective cognitions. Yes, as he does in particular in the transcendental deduction, but also in the transcendental analytic more generally. So he's thinking about the actual use of categories for a particular purpose, but the nature of his own thinking, yes, and we can maybe call the transcendental method, is not that clear to what extent Kant himself is actually using any categories. Yes, or at least if you want to make the point that he's using a category like unity or reciprocity or totality or whatever, at the level of his own transcendental philosophy, I think the case can be made, but I think it's not that easy to see what it means for Kant to be actually employing particular categories. Yeah, so I had the impression that you were taking this a bit too lightly. Yes, as if it is a matter of course.
Actually, I'm not. It's just that I'm making a very narrow point here. I'm just saying, well, there are a couple of things, couple of passages that prima facie say something about the reciprocity between concepts and intuition, and also the idea of Kant's transcendental philosophy as an immanent ontology. So your point is well taken. Okay, let me just quickly paraphrase the point that you're making. The claim that you made was that, in a sense, is Kant using his own categories to articulate his transcendental method?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's exactly the intervention. That's exactly my methodological point. That's the question that I'm going into this particular project with. I'm saying, yeah, I mean, if Kant is working out a transcendental methodology, well, that has to be from the finite discursive perspective. Right. And so, it has to be within the range of the formal use of the categories, right? And if that's the case, then how does one reconstruct the transcendental methodology in relation to those particular categories, right? And for me, this particular passage that I cited and that I discussed, the way he discusses the category of quality, is sort of a clue. And through this category, I'm then reading the section on the transcendental method, right? In part. So that's the larger project. So I completely agree with you, actually, right? But that's the larger project. And I've sort of offered you only a very small part of it, right? Because I do think that Heidegger gets this right. Heidegger is, when he thinks of his Kant's transcendental methodology, is also thinking in this way, in this methodological way. He's saying, well, let's look to see how Kant himself would characterize, using his own analytic, his transcendental methodology. That's why the questions about completeness and so on.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for, I think that brings us to the end of this question and answer. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. So I think we had, let me just take 2 minutes to summarize the discussion. I think we had a wonderful presentations. I think I find Vivek's paper on what Kant said on India not only interesting, but I think it's challenging because it is now important for us to look at what is the value or seriousness that we can assign to this. This is a very this is an important question for me. And I think Kanchana brings a very interesting contestation, which I think I put this on par with what P.C. Bhattacharya's relation with Kant, where she's taking how the only point that I want to you will dilute Kant on human being. I think there is this problem. It is not nature plus human being. It is nature versus human being. So we have to work out different kinds of proportionality that we may have to now read into Kant. So Kanchana, thank you very much for bringing that very important dimension into the discussion. The point, Apar's presentation has brought one important point, reminded me of my MA days when we joined for philosophy at University of Hyderabad. The book that was taught to us in the first semester is E.F. Strawson's descriptions, individuals. And then, so I thought that what one can relook at apart is what is the context of naming Kant as a descriptive metaphysician? Because given the onslaught of logical positivism and then the rejection of synthetic a priori and things like that, I think it is that revisiting that from your presentation will go a long way in rejuvenating interest in Kant. Nishant, thank you very much for that very, very dense presentation. I would only think that what we will expect a book from you where we want you to look at taking stock of Kant after Husserl. See, because what happens, Kant and then Husserl comes. But then, how much of what Husserl said on Kant is relevant? How much of what Husserl said on Kant is not relevant? How much of Husserl said on Kant can become problematic? I think, this is what will invigorate our students. Otherwise, what happens is they read Kant and they read Husserl and then get lost between them. I think what is important for us, it's a good content, a relevant thing is just, okay, this is what has happened. And now, where does Kant stand? Do you completely dismiss him, or do you completely accept him, or you accept and reject? So I think these are the various challenges that I see as a possibility for, further research on Kant in India. Thank you very much for being very patient. I apologize for cutting you short because Vivek strictly told me 2 hours, and now I'm just clicking 2 hours because we started 10 minutes late. So I'm a teacher, so I take time seriously. So I apologize you if I have been rude. And thank you, Vivek and Luis, for giving me this opportunity to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Dr.
much,
Marathi.
everyone.
It was
Thank you.
really great, and thank you also, Vivek, for putting the session together. It was a great success, and I just posted the schedule of the VKC on the chat, and the next session will be curated by the Society for Kant Studies in Spanish language. It will take place next Monday at 4 p.m. European time, Central European time. So you're all warmly invited to join us. And now you are all also invited to stay connected to the informal part of the session. So thank you so much once again. It was really good. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.